Hello and welcome to in-depth analysis of Indian Express from the perspective of UPSC examination, prelims, mains as well as interview stage. Let's start the discussion with a very interesting topic, and coincidentally that has also appeared on page number 1. In nuclear energy push, the government to allow private operators and limit their liability. In what could set the stage for unprecedented opening up of civil nuclear sector, the government is likely to move two crucial amendments in the laws governing the country's atomic energy sector in upcoming monsoon session of Parliament. These two laws happen to be Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010 and Atomic Energy Act 1962. When it comes to current affairs, there are very few topics like this, which have coverage from GS Paper 1, GS Paper 2, GS Paper 3 as well as GS Paper 4. So for the rest of the articles that we are going to cover, they are mainly limited for one or in max two papers. But here you can see that location of the nuclear power reactors in our country is important from the point of view of GS Paper 1, location of industries. Because it requires the amendment in the law, you are required to prepare it for GS Paper 2 purposes as well. It deals with essential matters of renewable and non-renewable energy. So it is pertinent for GS Paper 3, Economy, Science and Technology as well as Environment. And decisions related to nuclear power raise very valid questions with respect to ethics and integrity. So we are going to deal with all these perspectives segregated into topics according to the GS Paper 1, GS Paper 2, GS Paper 3 and GS Paper 4. But before we begin the discussion, let's first understand what are the kind of questions that can be asked in GS Paper 3 or 2 or 4. Private sector participation is being introduced in India's nuclear energy industry. Critically analyze how this could influence India's progress towards energy security and climate goals. Will it be net positive game for India? So you can see that the question has two demands, because the opening statement is just a statement. It does not need you to answer anything. The first part of the question, however, is critically analyze how this could influence India's progress towards energy security and climate goals. And the second question is, will it overall be an advantageous situation for India or will it be a disadvantageous situation for India? Whereas for GS Paper 2 or 4, the question could be the opening up of nuclear power sector raises issues of liability, safety and public trust. Evaluate the ethical dimensions involved in diluting supplier liability and involving private players in high-risk industry. How can transparency and accountability be ensured in nuclear governance to uphold the public interests? Write the answer in 250 words. Now, after going through this discussion, if you want to answer this question in the comment section, we are more than open for it. Or if you want to upload the PDF, you can send it on our Telegram channel and we would be more than happy to give you the feedback. As far as the prelims exam is concerned, the geographical location of pre-existing and upcoming power plants can be asked. At the same time, a technical term small modular reactor appears in this discussion that could also be pertinent from the point of view of prelims examination. So in order to understand this particular issue, you have to understand that atomic energy production has been one of India's most closed sectors. Even after going through liberalization, privatization and globalization in 1990s, some of the sectors were never opened for private participation. They were kept under strong state control, and atomic nuclear production is one of such sectors. So while we have seen privatization in defense, in space, to some extent in railways as well, but we have not seen any initiative by the government so far in the direction of private participation in nuclear energy production. That is mainly because of the law by the name of Atomic Energy Act 1962, which allows state-owned companies such as NPCIL to produce nuclear energy in our country. While some initiatives were taken in 2010 to give effect to India-US civil nuclear deal, which allowed the transfer of latest and cutting-edge civil nuclear reactors to our country, which led to a lot of protests in our country, which forced the government of India to table a bill, Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010, which basically sought to create a mechanism for compensating victims from damage caused by nuclear accident and allocating liability and specifying procedures for compensation. Which meant that if, for example, Hitachi or Westinghouse or any French nuclear company like Areva, if they transferred an equipment to be used in India and if they defaulted or there was some accident, the people of India could claim damages from these private companies. And this is very, very important in Indian context, which has seen industrial disasters epitomized by Bhopal gas tragedy. Now, because of these two legal hindrances, the private participation in India never happened. And that is why the government now thinks of bringing the amendment to both these acts, allowing private entry and at the same time capping the liability that can be claimed against private players in nuclear energy. Let's start by looking at the locations. Now you can see that the texts have been written in two kinds of fonts. One is bold and another one is a little bit faint. The fainter ones are the ones which already exist in our country, like Narora, Ravatbhata, Kakrapar, Tarapur, Kaiga, Kalpakkam and Kodalkulam. The bold ones are the new reactors that are coming up at already existing locations or at altogether fresh locations. For example, Kumhaira in Haryana and Bargi in central India. So after going through the overview of the locations of nuclear power plant in our country, you can see how the perspective of GS paper 1 comes into play. Overall, India's civil nuclear footprint has a western and southern tilt, and only one in northeast and absolutely zero in this part of the country. Now you have to understand that as critical infrastructure as nuclear technology and the location of such plant is driven by resource availability, for example, cooling water and fuel transport, how easy it is to get the fresh water, because that's what acts as a coolant, whether the area is free from seismic activity or not. And that is why the chances of having a nuclear power reactor in this particular area and in northeast are very, very low. And of course, historical development under a planned economy through 5 plans have been one of the major guides of locations for the nuclear power installations in our country. So as the nuclear power expands, mapping these installations is crucial for infrastructure planning and disaster management. Obviously, I've explained the aspects of GS paper 2, policy, legal and international dimensions with respect to foreign policy matters. India's atomic energy sector has traditionally been a state monopoly governed by Atomic Energy Act 1962, which barred private sector involvement in nuclear power generation. Additionally, the Civil Liability and Nuclear Damage Act 2010, enacted after Indo-US nuclear deal, introduced a significant liability regime. While this act created a framework for compensating nuclear accident victims and channeled primary liability to the plant operator, it also included the controversial provision allowing the operator a right of recourse against equipment suppliers in case of an accident caused by a supplier's fault. And we know that most of the equipments would be foreign based. And the problem was that there was no explicit cap or the maximum amount of damage that can be claimed up to 80 years after the plant starts up. This deviates from international norms, which channel all liability exclusively to the operator and has made foreign reactor vendors apprehensive of open-ended legal exposure. And that is why the government's recent proposal seeks to amend both laws to remove these bottlenecks. The first amendment will ease the nuclear liability law by capping the liability of equipment vendors in event of an accident. As per reports, the plan is to limit supplier liability to the original contract value of the equipment and to impose a time frame beyond which suppliers cannot be sued for accidents. In effect, this would eliminate the unlimited and long tail liability risk that current law places on suppliers, aligning India more closely with International Convention on Supplementary Compensation, or otherwise abbreviated as CSC. This also addresses the key concern of United States of America, France and Japan, which are the countries which have the latest nuclear technology with the private companies. And these countries had cited the nuclear liability as the deal breaker for doing nuclear business with India. By assuring a finite liability, the amendment is expected to instill confidence in international suppliers group and insurers, thus reviving stalled projects like Bada in Andhra Pradesh, where talks with the Westinghouse, an American company, had run aground over liability issues. When it comes to foreign policy and strategic implications, you can see that India-US nuclear deal was a landmark that ended India's nuclear isolation, but its commercial payoff has been elusive. We don't see much power production under private sector in India or the suppliers participating in India's civil nuclear program. When the deal was signed, some of the most famous companies like General Electric and Westinghouse were very excited about Miti and Kovada nuclear sites. But nearly 17 years after the deal, not a single US designed reactor is under completion or even beginning of the construction in India. This is not just an economic but rather a strategic signal. It reassures Washington that India is addressing legal bottlenecks and is serious about deepening civil nuclear partnership with US. At the same time, it could make India's nuclear market more attractive in global tenders and supply chains, which will help collaborations in reactor design, fuel cycle technology, and such technology transfers taking place for India, enhancing the overall indigenous technology as a result of competition as well. While it will strengthen our relationship with developed countries, it might also invite a lot of protests locally, especially at the locations where the installations have been planned. When you look at it from the point of view of GS Paper 3, which includes economy, environment, and technology, it has multiple such dimensions. For one, you can clearly see that opening the nuclear sector is expected to have significant economic implications. Nuclear power currently is about 3% of India's electricity mix, and the government has set up a target of 100 gigawatt of nuclear capacity by 2047. In fact, in the budget of 2025, Finance Minister herself explicitly highlighted nuclear energy as a vital to India's energy transition and climate goals. But at the same time, this will require massive capital infusion, far beyond the annual budget of the Department of Economic Energy, and so clearly indicating that the Government of India will not have the finances to take up this massive project. And so if we open the private sector investment in civil nuclear technology in India, it is going to ease the burden off from the government, at the same time allowing the country to meet the targets. But civil nuclear technology is not a trivial matter. One economic challenge is the cost of civil nuclear power related to other sources. Historically, nuclear electricity in India has been more expensive than coal and often higher than renewables due to high capital and long gestation period, which means that initial investment is very high, and at the same time it takes a lot of time, 3 to 4 decades, to recover the initial cost. If private players come in, they will demand a competitive rate of return. This might require guaranteed purchase agreements or inclusion of nuclear under clean energy incentives. Otherwise, again, the private sector will stop short of investment. The Government of India sees nuclear technology and civil nuclear energy as important for energy security and stable base load power. The base load power, that is an average power that is required by the entire country all the time. For a very long time, technologically, a better alternative that has been suggested is small modular reactors, which are very small 50 to 300 megawatt reactors, which are created at a very small level. They have very low upfront costs, they have very shortened construction times, and at the same time, they are very suitable for remote or industrial applications like captive energy nuclear plants. In fact, Ministry of Atomic Energy announced Bharat MSR initiative in 2023 to design an indigenous 220 megawatt modular pressurized heavy water reactor by using Indian domestic technology. Now, when it comes to environmental and safety consideration, you can see that nuclear energy is low carbon power source. Expanding nuclear capacity aligns with India's pledge to increase non-fossil energy and reach net zero by 2070. From an ecological standpoint, nuclear plants have relatively small carbon footprint, but on the other hand, they use large volumes of water for cooling, impacting local water resources and aquatic life due to hot water discharge. The most important concern that everyone should pay attention is towards nuclear safety and what will happen to the waste that will continue to remain radioactive. So preventing accidents and containing any radiation is the key problem. The involvement of private operator raises such questions. Will safety standards be maintained by people who are mainly driven by profit orientation? And what will happen to the mega disposal of resources? And what will happen to the mega waste that will be generated is still an unresolved question, because radioactivity never dies. It just is reduced to half every half life. So theoretically, it will never come to zero, and radiations will continue to be emitted by any kind of waste that will come out of nuclear power plants. And so, with more reactors, especially if some are in new localities, India should be ready with disaster preparedness for the worst kind of case, as happened with Japan in Fukushima Daiichi. Now look at the GS paper 4 relevant dimensions. The question of liability and moral responsibility. The proposal to cap supplier liability touches upon principles of justice and accountability. Because on one hand, the existing law was driven by moral lesson of Bhopal, that victims of a catastrophic industrial accident deserve adequate compensation and those at fault should not escape responsibility. And diluting this responsibility by absolving suppliers beyond a point can seem like prioritizing corporate interests over the rights of potential victims. At the same time, it has issues related to intergenerational equity as well. As while today's society gains electricity and reduced carbon emission, future generations inherit the long-term management of radioactive waste and decommissioned plants. What will the future generation do with whatever remains after we have exhausted the electricity? Large infrastructure projects often raise the issue of distributive justice as well. Who bears the risk and who enjoys the benefit? We, urban and industrial consumers, will get the power, while largely rural and tribal population will get the plant sites. And obviously, with large investments and international contracts, ethical concerns about corruption and regulatory capture may arise. It's vital to have integrity in procurement and project management to avoid any safety compromising shortcuts. So you can see that GS4 dimension reminds policymakers that ends do not justify the means. Pursuing clean energy and strategic gains is laudable, appreciable, very good, but it must be done by upholding ethical norms, which is safeguarding human life, being transparent, ensuring justice for all stakeholders, and not compromising future generations' well-being. So before I end this discussion, I would like to flash the mains question as well as the prelims question to remind you of your responsibility to answer them. The next important news explains or gives an opportunity to explain a very, very important term related to economy, that is AGR, or adjusted gross revenue. The government find itself in serious dilemma over Vodafone India's financial crisis, as this telecom operator has approached the Supreme Court seeking a waiver of 45,000 crore in adjustment gross revenue related dues. So in order to make sense of this particular news article, we will first have to understand what AGR is. What is the policy of the government with respect to AGR? In 2021, the government gave something, a kind of a bounty to the telecom sectors, which is about to expire in some time from now in 2025, and that is when Vodafone is raising concerns. So you can see that AGR, or adjusted gross revenue, refers to total revenue earned by telecom companies in India. Why AGR is important? Because as a percentage of AGR, or adjusted gross revenue, the telecom operators have to pay a percentage of that as license fees, spectrum usage charges, and contribution to Universal Service Obligation Fund, a kind of fund which is utilized by the government to extend telecom services into underserved areas. So let's try to understand it by understanding the liberalization. When the telecom sector was liberalized in 1994, National Telecom Policy was brought, where private sector and private companies were allowed to participate in telecom services, but they had to pay a fixed license fees. Because of the low penetration and low revenue, it became extremely difficult for telecom companies to give that fixed license fees. And that is why in 1999, a revenue sharing model was brought. You do the business, and depending upon the kind of revenues that you get, as a fixed percentage of that revenue, give it to the government. So if your revenue is higher, the government's profit will be higher. If your revenue will be low, you don't have to worry about much of the charges to provide relief from the steep fixed license fees. where mobile operators were to share a percentage of their adjusted gross revenue with the government for their annual license fees to operate and spectrum usage charges as well. The problem arose with respect to how to calculate the adjusted gross revenue, because you can see that this is a financial or an accounting method. The revenues that the telecom company they get it from their core business. For example, providing internet services as well as network. But a lot of the revenue comes to the telecom company from non-core businesses as well. For instance, any interest that they earn on loans extended, any value-added service that they provide. Now the problem became as to what constitutes the adjusted gross revenue. The claim of the telecom companies was that the profit or the revenue coming only from their core telecom business would count as an AGR, and only the percentage of the core revenue should be liable to be shared with the government. Whereas the claim of the government was that when we signed the deal, it was about all the revenue, not just from core revenue, and it is core plus non-core as well. This case reached Supreme Court, and finally Supreme Court decided the matter in favor of the government, where Supreme Court ruled that AGR of telecom operators would include both core as well as non-core revenues. And as soon as this was decided, most of the telecom company came under distress, because most of them had only shared a percentage of their core revenue with the government. And this meant that most of the corporate companies had a lot of dues compounded with the interest to be paid to the government, and they came under extreme financial distress, because of which the government came for telecom relief package in 2021, where a moratorium was put for 4 years on the dues to be cleared. The government gave an option to the companies to convert their dues into equity. So which means that, let's say, if a particular company had 40,000 crore to be paid to the government, its overall valuation, let's say, was 1 lakh crore, which means 40% of that was owed to the government. And so that company was given an option: sell 40% of your company's stake to the government. Government will waive off the dues. Also, the government gave an option of exclusion of non-telecom revenues as well, and foreign investment up to the tune of 100% of FDI was allowed to ease off the pain of the telecom companies. In fact, by the time of recording of this particular video, the Supreme Court has dismissed the petitions from Vodafone Idea, Bharti Airtel and Tata Teleservices seeking waivers on interest penalties and interest on penalties related to AGR dues. The court labelled these petitions as misconceived and upheld the government's stance on this matter. Now, this particular issue has multiple implications on telecom sector. It will induce financial strain. Telecom companies face significant financial burdens due to the inclusion of non-core revenues in AGR calculation. Also, the financial stability of major players like Vodafone Idea could disrupt the market competition and affect service quality of consumers. Also, the government's involvement, including converting a portion of dues into equity, reflects attempts to stabilize the sector, but challenges still persist. Let's now move on to the next news article that has appeared in the form of opinion in the Indian Express today. Written by Alok Prasanna Kumar, who happens to be the co-founder of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy and who's also an advocate in Supreme Court of India. He has expressed his opinion with respect to the recent presidential reference in case of Tamil Nadu governor case given by the president. There are few issues that are being raised as a result of this tussle going on between the executive and the judiciary. Now, if you look at the India's constitutional history after 1950, this is not the first time where executive and judiciary have been colliding or are at least seen to be colliding with each other. This particular case is directly pertinent for syllabus of GS paper 2, which talks about structure, organization, functioning of executive and judiciary. No other case in recent times can highlight the functioning of executive and judiciary, and especially a kind of functioning which has not been exactly anticipated according to the Constitution of India, because in this particular case, both executive as well as judiciary have been seen to cross the lines set by the Constitution. So the big question is whether the Union government can use Article 143, a mechanism of presidential reference, to overturn the Supreme Court's recent judgment, curving the power of the governor to delay or deny assent to the state legislation. Short answer is no. But of course, first we'll have to understand the provision of Article 143, and then we will have to understand as to how Article 143 or advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court cannot be used by the Supreme Court to overturn its judgment in any of the cases. So when you look at Article 143, read the text and let's now understand actual mechanism. So the makers of the Constitution understood that there could be some problematic decisions that the executive or the parliament might have to take. The decisions which could be struck down by the Supreme Court for their violation of fundamental right or any other constitutional flagrants. Because of which the makers of the Constitution included a very, very good mechanism known as advisory jurisdiction, where President can refer, look at the arrow, President can refer any matter to the Supreme Court. However, President can refer only such legal questions as has not been decided by the court earlier, so it has to be a fresh question. And there is no condition that the President can refer only such question as pertain to his own powers, functions and duties or those of central government. Any question can be recommended for reference to the Supreme Court by the President. So you know that President for all its functions acts on aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, which means that whenever Council of Ministers face any kind of legal problem, confusion, skepticism, that's when through President they refer a particular matter to the Supreme Court. Now if you read the Bare Act, Article 143, there are two kinds of conditions that have been thought about. If the President has referred to the Supreme Court any pre-constitutional matter, any matter that is excluded from the original exclusive jurisdiction of the Supreme Court under Article 131, which means pre-constitutional treaty, agreement or sanad, the Supreme Court shall hear the case and shall report their opinion. Supreme Court cannot deny reporting their opinion. However, if there is any other matter from pre-constitutional matter, it is not obligatory on Supreme Court to express its opinion. So Supreme Court can say, okay, we heard the case and we don't feel like giving you any opinion. You do whatever you want to do and we'll see it later. Or Supreme Court might even say that no, we are not going to listen to this matter as well. In either of the cases, however, whether the opinion is expressed by the court in the matter where it is mandatory for the Supreme Court to express its opinion, or it is not mandatory, in both these cases, the opinion expressed by the Supreme Court is not binding on the President. So in this particular case, what has happened is that President has referred few questions to the Supreme Court with regard to the power of the President and the Governor for the reservation of the bill, especially with regard to the latest judgment of the Supreme Court, where Supreme Court introduced timelines in the exercise of the power of the President and the Governor to assent to the state legislative assembly bills, which crucially cut down the discretionary power of the Governor as well as the President. Because the Constitution of India did not insert any kind of timelines. Now the timelines have been inserted by the Supreme Court. And that is why President has asked few questions, which if you are reading the newspaper last week, you might have gone through those discussions. So once we have understood the mechanism of Article 143, according to author, the reason behind the presidential reference is to force the Supreme Court to cancel its recent judgment by expressing an opinion which will go against the opinion or the order given by the two judges bench. To which the author says that that is not possible. Article 143 only gives the Supreme Court an advisory jurisdiction. That means that the President can ask court for its opinion, but that does not undo or overrides an earlier judgment that has attained finality. So the order given by the Supreme Court by its two-judge bench cannot be overridden by an opinion expressed under Article 143 presidential reference. In order to support his claim, author presents two previous instances. A natural resource allocation case 2012, which is famously known as 2G spectrum case, where the government tried something similar. For all the new aspirants who might not have exposure to this particular case, the government of India adopted a very different kind of policy for 2G spectrum allocation, the allocation of licenses for 2G telecom services. It was challenged in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled that spectrum should only be auctioned as they are natural resources of the society, which created a huge problem for telecom sector, because of which the UPA government sent a reference under Article 143 to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not overturn its earlier judgment. It simply clarified that auctions are preferable, not mandatory. The verdict itself withstood. All of us know that appointment of higher judiciary is exactly not per se the constitutional provision, because constitution provision says that consultation of Supreme Court Chief Justice of India, because according to the constitutional provision, President will appoint the judges and President will consult with the Chief Justice of India while appointing other puisne judges of the Supreme Court. But we know when it comes to the appointment of higher judiciary, it is the collegium system which recommends the name, which are then notified by the President of India. How did this happen? This happened through a long history of 4 judges' cases. Now in the second judge's case, Supreme Court said that the consultation is binding, reading consultation and replacing it with the word concurrence. Now this was against the constitutional provision, because of which in third judge's cases in 1998, the President asked the Supreme Court to reconsider its judgment. In this case also, Supreme Court did not overturn the judgment. It just clarified the collegium system, largely going in the favor of the second judge's case. So even if the verdict stays, there is a possibility that legal principles could be fine-tuned, but there is no possibility that the Supreme Court will overturn its previous judgment. The author wants the Supreme Court to consider this presidential reference because of 2 specific reasons. One of the reasons has to do with a very, very powerful jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to force the public authorities into what is their legal obligation known as mandamus. The 2-judge bench ruled that the court can order the president to clear a bill, and it is a very, very problematic precedent because it puts the president under judiciary's thumb, which alters the balance of constitutional powers. So far we have known that governors and presidents cannot be taken under the power of the Supreme Court to issue mandamus, because both of them act as the head of the respective political association. President is the essence of the sovereignty of India. No one is above him. In order to issue the mandamus, you have to be above him or her. And so this kind of remedy could invite contempt proceeding against president, which is both unprecedented, undesirable and impracticable in Indian separation of power. The second problem is the order in Tamil Nadu governor case was given by just 2 judges bench, division bench. And it is such an important constitutional matter that the author actually wonders whether it can or should be handed out by such a small judges bench, when we know that most of the constitutional matters are referred to the benches larger than 5 judges bench, or at least equal to the 5 judges bench. So larger benches bring more diverse opinions, deeper reasoning and a better sense of constitutional balance. Yet there are no clear rules on when constitutional question should be referred to a larger bench, and it itself needs a kind of fixation by the Supreme Court. And that brings us to the initial remark that I made, that this particular case epitomizes the misuse of powers both at the hand of the executive as well as at the Supreme Court. And hence, it emerges like a growing crisis between the constitutional authorities, because governors, acting as an agent of center at the state, refuse to do their basic duties for political reasons. We know that the governor is controlled by Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, for exercise of all its functions and powers at the state level, if he or she takes instructions from the central government, it directly goes against the federal structure, which is the decentralization of power, and it also goes against the democratic norms at the state level. So there is no denying the fact, from Sarkaria Commission to Punchi Commission, all the center-state relation commissions have recommended cutting down the discretionary power of the governor. So the author urges Supreme Court not to back off, because it will allow the constitutional machinery to collapse. And so the author says there are only 2 options. The Supreme Court should act boldly and offer a modified but firm direction and face criticism for judicial overreach, where judiciary oversteps the constitutional limit, or the other option is that it might step back and allow a dangerous breakdown of constitutional order, which is, I think, less desirable option as of now. Next up for discussion is an opinion expressed by Mr. Michael Kugelman, who is an international relations scholar specializing in Southeast Asia and South Asia, who expresses his opinion about US intervention in India's and Pakistan relation. Now, when you look at the GS paper 2 syllabus under international relation, not only India and its neighborhood relation is a part of your syllabus, but effect of policies and politics of developed countries on India's interests is a part of your syllabus as well. Now, because US has or supposedly has intervened to induce ceasefire between India and Pakistan, just going through an opinion expressed by a prominent scholar in IR becomes extremely important. So let's look at the summary of what he has to say. So Kugelman says that at first glance, it seemed improbable, even laughable, that Trump administration had anything to do with the recent ceasefire between India and Pakistan. After all, both countries have long insisted that Kashmir and related issues are to be settled bilaterally, especially India. India's official stance, reiterated once again on May 13, is clear: no third-party mediation. Washington too appeared content to maintain a safe distance, with President Trump and Vice President Vance offering generic, they will figure out themselves kind of statements. And yet, behind this diplomatic poker face, a more subtle and possibly decisive American role was unfolding. Let's be clear. According to the author, the ceasefire was not dictated by the US, nor was it negotiated at an American table. But the US was undeniably in the room. What author wants to say is that the ceasefire was not forced by the American, but at best it could have been facilitated. So when the ceasefire was being negotiated, we can clearly see that America was present on the same table, working behind the scenes quietly, tactically, and with growing urgency. But the question is, what forced America to even change its stance on India and Pakistan relations, with which it has directly or indirectly maintained quite a safe distance? Now, there are two reasons that stand out according to the author. Number one, the intensity of escalation this time was unlike previous flare-ups. So previously, India and Pakistan have gone through major wars in 1947, then in 1965, 1971, then in Kargil War, and then intermittently India and Pakistan go through a lot of ceasefire violations and minor skirmishes. But unlike the previous ones, the situation was rapidly sliding from a border skirmish into a full-blown war that concerned US. Secondly, the nuclear shadow that was imminent. India's strike near the Noor Khan base in Rawalpindi, close to Pakistan's nuclear command, triggered alarm bells in Washington. Pakistan's abrupt announcement of a National Command Authority meeting only deepened the fears. For the Americans, it was a deja vu. Past crises like Kargil standoff, Balakot surgical airstrike in 2019 had seen Washington step up in precisely when the nuclear threshold felt dangerously close. And that's when Americans decided to intervene, when they realized that this could escalate to an imminent nuclear war between two very powerful military forces in Asia. So according to the author, these are the two main reasons because of which Americans decided to intervene. So while America did not pull the ceasefire strings, it helped lay the groundwork. This came in many forms. Diplomatic muscle. For example, Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance, who immediately dialed up both the governments as well as the militaries. Trade leverage was utilized, with minor signals that better US-India or US-Pakistan trade deals might hinge on dialing down the heat. So there are clear-cut indications that are emerging which suggest that American government had threatened the trade blockage of either India or Pakistan, either one of them, if they do not come on the negotiating table. And perhaps the most important one was the timing. By the time US nudged or persuaded both sides towards the table, each had already achieved face-saving wins, which according to the political scholar is constructive ambiguity, where everyone involved gets something. No one is declared as a defeated party, and the world for now stepped back from the brink. So both India and Pakistan, by the fourth day of the battle, had something to claim as a victory for their own audience. But according to the author, the ceasefire is still very fragile. It is not long lasting. It rests more on temporary political convenience than lasting peace. The next provocation could bring us right back to the edge of nuclear war. And if that happens, don't be surprised if the US reappears, not in front of the camera, but very much in background. Because while Washington may be preoccupied with Ukraine, Gaza, and China, a near nuclear standoff in Asia will always be too big to ignore. The next news article is very important from the perspective of GS Paper 3. While it looks like by the heading that it should be mapped to GS Paper 2, which talks about the use of AI models, large language models, in law and jurisprudence. But artificial intelligence or large language models are, after all, technology. And if you look at the syllabus, under GS Paper 3, science and technology developments and their applications and effects in everyday life is a part of your GS Paper 3 syllabus. And so, let's quickly have a look at this, what seemingly looked like not a very important article, but how you can use this to answer your question in GS Paper 2 as well, GS Paper 3 as well as in GS Paper 4. You understand that Indian judiciary has long battled a very, very chronic crisis of pendency, crippling pendency. Tariq pe Tariq has become the norm for the Indian judiciary. A slogan given by Sunny Deol 30 years ago is still true. A shortage of judges, stenographers, burden of mountain of paperwork, crores of cases pending from lower court to higher court to Supreme Court does not tells a very good picture of Indian justice system. But in the background of all this institutional inertia, a quiet revolution is underway, and its name is Adalat AI. At its core, Adalat AI is just not another tech startup. It represents a paradigm shift in how India's courts can function in 21st century, where judges will not need any kind of support, or at least they will need minimal kind of support in writing their orders, doing their own research, and it will also be helpful for lawyers. So let's quickly understand the problems. More files, fewer hands. Indian judiciary, especially the Indian lower judiciary, suffers from the shortage of the staff to support the judges. While each judge is on an average expected to go through probably 100 to 200, in some cases 300 cases, a judge at the lower than district judge level, Munsif magistrate and chief judicial magistrates, are supported by barely 2 or in some cases 3 people. But every judgment and every hearing requires good amount of research. But the judges do not have that support staff. Also, if you look at the judges to population ratio, we have less than 1 high court judge per 10 lakh population, especially in probably the most advanced and focused union territory, Delhi. Over 70% of the prisoners are under trials who are stuck in the loop because their cases are not being heard. So their liberty is being constrained not because they are guilty, but because the judges do not have the time to go through their cases. At the same time, there is a stark lack of stenographers, which further plagues the system. So one of the lines that has been used in this particular statement is when a court staffer put it bluntly, half our time goes into sorting out the files. And that's when Adalat AI comes into play, which is a tech startup co-founded by Utkarsh Saxena and Agya Bhattacharya, which offers speech-to-text transcription trained specifically on Indian legal jargon, which has accents across 11 regional languages, and data from 1 lakh plus court orders have been fed. So this AI model has been trained on more than 1 lakh court orders. So it is going to be extremely helpful for the judges because it will enable the judges to log in, just speak their orders, read their orders, and then just at the instance of a click, it will generate printable judgments where no stenographer or support staff will be needed, no manual dictation, and no endless typing. Similarly, there is another AI intervention in the field of law which can help lawyers, which is by the name of Ask Junior, developed by Renu Gupta. The article mentioned that this particular large language model summarizes Supreme Court judgments with 96% accuracy, which will help lawyers to immediately extract key facts, important points made in hundreds and pages of long judgments. And it also tells you which are the relevant provisions of law and the constitution which might be relevant while making an argument. So you can see how smooth and efficient our legal jurisprudence can be made by incorporating AI into the system. The news that appears next is very, very important. Northeast Kolkata route via Myanmar, not Bangladesh. And it is quite an important step that has been taken by the government of India. In fact, the plan to connect India and India's northeast through any other route except Bangladesh had already been in existence. See, the problem is that India's northeast is connected with India with a very, very small corridor known as Chicken's Neck, passing through Siliguri corridor. And if you look at the strategic position of this very thin patch of land, it is surrounded by three countries. One is Nepal, another one is very closely situated China, and of course you can see Bangladesh. It puts India into an extremely vulnerable situation because we have seen that China has already been hostile and has clearly shown its intention to move very close to the chicken's neck. Bangladesh turns hostile on and off depending upon which government is in power, and Nepal has been showing increasing hostility towards India. Now, in that kind of situation, it became extremely important for the country to develop an alternative route to reach out to our northeast, which is not connected with mainland India with proper infrastructure. And that is where Kaladan multimodal project comes into picture. The news relates to the Kaladan multimodal project, where the government of India has recently sanctioned a very critical railway infrastructure connecting Shillong and Silchar. So before we can analyze strategic and geopolitical relevance and engineering innovations that have been included in this project, let's first have a zoomed in look at this multimodal project. Now, as the name itself talks about the project being multimodal, which means that it is just not one way of transport that is being used in this project, but it is a combination of multiple kinds of transport routes that will be used to connect Kolkata or mainland India with the northeastern states. The connection between Kolkata and Sitwe port located in Myanmar, which is a 539-kilometer stretch, will be covered by ship through Bay of Bengal. Although this route has technically been operational for decades, India has invested significant resources to upgrade the Sitwe port to increase its capability and capacity. This part of the project has been complete. So this project has been done and dusted. Then comes the connection between Sitwe upstream of Kaladan river leading up to Paletwa. This 158-kilometer stretch on Kaladan river in Myanmar will be covered by boat. The ME has invested in dredging the river and constructing required jetty facilities at Paletwa to handle 300-ton barges. The river is navigable and all work has been completed on this project as well. Then you have Paletwa to Zorinpui. 108-kilometer 4-lane road will be the last leg of the corridor in Myanmar. Myanmar has granted all approvals for this part of the project, and the integrated customs and immigration checkpost at India-Myanmar border has been completed in 2017. And that's when this project enters into Indian territory through here, which is the next leg, Zorinpui to Aizawl and beyond. While Zorinpuri is connected to Aizawl and the rest of the northeast by road, the government of India plans to eventually extend the high-speed corridor from Shillong all the way to the border town. And that is why today's news is relevant, because the government has approved the railway track between Shillong and Silchar. So when it comes to strategic and geopolitical relevance, it reduces overall reliance on vulnerable Siliguri corridor. It integrates with Kaladan multimodal project, which will be used to connect all the states of northeast with mainland India, especially Kolkata. It counters Bangladesh maritime leverage over northeast and China's strategic narrative in the region. It bolsters India's Act East policy as well by linking Tripura, Mizoram, Manipur and Barak Valley. As you can see that this is a multimodal project, and so of course a lot of technological interventions were needed at the same time. So of course it caters to tough and hilly terrains. The project uses LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging based surveys, to finalize and fine-tune the understanding of the topography of northeast. At various places it has used slope stabilization, rock mechanics and real-time monitoring piezometers, geophones, rain gauges, settlement gauges, and inclinometers. It includes 19 major bridges, 22 underpasses, 34 viaducts, and over 500 minor structures. Once this is complete, you can say once this project will be complete, you will see that India will, once this project is, the completion of this project is going to give India huge leverage over access to Northeast.